Since it has been announced in the patch notes that Hastened Fatalis will be removed from the game, I have gotten a ton of questions on how exactly that affects certain characters, how good the new items are and whatnot. That is exactly what we're going to look into in this video. First of all, a few words on Hastened Fatalis. Hastened Fatalis used to be a very unpopular item in previous seasons, mostly used by very few select characters like Freya, Bakasura or Kali. And other than that, it was pretty much frowned upon by hunter players. It was just a crutch for those who can't aim. With certain changes to the item, allowing it to be a little more potent, especially in the early game, and taking away some attack speed in exchange for some penetration, Hastened Fatalis became a little bit too potent. So it was nerfed again, specifically targeting the price as well, and the last iteration of the item that we have at the moment still is 1,450 gold for the final stage, 2,600 gold in total. It is 10 flat penetration, 25% attack speed and 10% movement speed. On top of that, it has the haste effect. When a basic attack hits a target, the attacking movement speed debuff is removed from you for 1 second. Why is it removed? Because hunters are not supposed to build it, at least according to what Hi-Rez has implied with their changes. The change is welcomed by most, at least most non-hunter players, as this is a very frustrating thing to deal with when you're playing against it. A highly mobile ranged character that deals a lot of damage to you can be very frustrating, and as such, the change is probably one that will not be reverted at this point. The intention with changes to Hastened Fatalis was never to make it viable for hunters, from what we can tell now. As such, measures are taken to bring similar items back to the characters who need it and who kind of depend on this item for the most part. However, hunters are not completely on the losing side here. They also get their own version of something similar, which we'll talk about as well. The first item we're going to talk about is Hastened Katana. Hastened Katana is basically the melee version of Hastened Fatalis, and it is the item that has been changed the least. It costs 2,400 gold, so a little bit cheaper, a little bit more accessible, as the last price tag was a little bit excessive, especially for those characters who depend on the item like Kali, like Bakasura. The movement speed remains the same, the attack speed remains the same, and the passive remains the same. The only thing that has changed is the 10 flat penetration turned into 25 physical power. This is actually not as much of a difference as some people seem to think it is. 25 power isn't bad, but it's also not exactly great. Neither is 10 flat pen. It's a very good stat to have early on, but it's not crazy. I'll spare you the direct comparison here, as it really depends on the character. A character with high base damage values will benefit more from flat penetration, whereas a character with high scalings will benefit more from having more raw power. In the end, the damage between the two should kinda somewhat even out. There shouldn't be a major difference depending on which character you're playing. If you want to have a better feel of how much extra damage Hastened Katana really is, then look at Ninja Tabi. Ninja Tabi has 5 power less and 5% attack speed less, which is really not that much in the bigger picture of things. It's also a fair bit cheaper if you look at the price difference. We're talking about 900 gold. So what you're paying here is 900 gold for a passive that gives you haste and 5% attack speed and 5 physical power. So the passive is valued quite highly if you're looking for this item, and that's because some characters value this passive very, very highly and really, really depend on it. But even if you're looking to build this item, you still want boots first. A, boots still give more raw movement speed, and B, boots are a lot cheaper, and you want to have something cheap to use in the early game in order to rotate quickly, and Hastened Katana doesn't offer that. There may be a case for building it in solo first if you're really ahead and you really want to play super aggressive, but that's pretty much it, and that only applies for very, very few select characters in very few situations, so generally not something that I would say is advisable. Overall, it's worth building on the melee characters that built it before, and maybe a few more. This is yet to be determined, but there are certain gods that possibly could make use of it. What I'm thinking of is Nemesis, who now has weaker slows and still depends on her AAs. So if somebody finds a strategy to implement it into a build, it could actually work somehow. Though I wouldn't say it's a priority item for her, and I would probably still prefer other items in pretty much any situation. But things can change here. And there may be other gods, like for example Vamana as well, who can benefit from this and maybe benefit even more than from the previous version. This is something that we'll see over time, and the same actually goes for all of these items. Generally speaking, Hastened Katana is a good item that is strong for those who can make use of it, and it's a little bit cheaper than Hastened Fatalis was in its last iteration, so that's very good. Hastened Ring is a bit of a different story. Hastened Ring is slightly cheaper with 2,300 gold. It has 50 magical power, 25% attack speed, and 7% movement speed. It's much harder to compare this to another item because there really isn't another item that functions exactly like this. You could compare it to Demonic Grip, but Demonic Grip really has a different purpose overall, and as such I will leave it as the standalone. Power-wise, it's roughly as much as the pen boots would give you, but only from the power stat and not the pen stat of it. So it will be a little less damage if you're just looking at abilities, while still being significantly more expensive and only giving 7% movement speed. The big deal here is that there are only 2 items that I would say are really worth picking up for attack speed and magical power, this and Demonic Grip now. So if you're looking for something AA oriented, then you kinda have to implement Hastened Ring. And you do want to, because this hasten effect is really strong for the AA mages that make use of it. This is the typical gods that were the ones that already used it before. It's Freya, it's Chronos, it's Sol. And it's kind of a different haste from what we have on the Hastened Katana. And that's for a good reason. If it was the same haste at Hastened Fatalis, kinda nothing would have changed for the ranged mages that play like hunters, and we'll probably get into a mage hunter meta pretty quickly just because they can still utilize it, or at least that is what would be attempted, and hunter players would just feel very left out and treated unfairly because mage hunters still get the same stuff. The haste here, however, works in a way where after hitting an enemy with a basic attack, not an ability, you get haste for 4 seconds, causing you immune to basic attack movement penalty for the duration. That means you don't have to hit the next hit afterwards like a melee would, but instead you will just have the haste for 4 seconds. However, in return, it has an internal cooldown of 30 seconds. So if you don't get your stuff done in those 4 seconds, well, good luck to you, you don't have your haste anymore. The interesting thing here is how much power Hastened Ring has now. Different from Hastened Katana, Hastened Ring actually brings you 50 power. I would say that, especially in later stages of the game, that's worth a little more than the 10 flat pen, even though I can see why the value here is significantly higher than the physical power. But the main point here is that this scales better. If you have a Rod of Tahuti later on, and you're looking for percentage pen along with it, where the flat pen doesn't matter all too much, then this can be pretty good. Previously, implementing Hastened Fatalis into a power-heavy build always meant that you have to do some certain drawback, you have to have some certain cuts in that build when it comes to the power due to Hastened. With Hastened Ring, you still get a solid amount of power. It's not crazy, it's obviously not Bancroft's or Spear of Desolation, but it can provide you with a decent enough power spike even in earlier stages of the game. I would say it's even possible to build this straight after your boots if you want to. It's not the best item there when you just look into ability poke, but if you're very AA focused, if you like a Freya, I think the 50 magical power will still be good, even though she also really benefit from the pen with her base damage values being relatively high. Freya is probably the best guard to show the limitations of this item. With Freya, you proc her 2, you proc her 1, and then you have roughly 5 seconds. So 2 has a 6-second duration, and in combination with the 1, you'll probably end up with around 5 seconds. And then you hit the enemy. By the time the hit connects and your passive procs, you should have roughly 4.5 to 5-ish seconds left on your 2. And that's good, because you kinda have haste for almost the same duration as your 2. So in that very time frame, you can just spam down on the enemy and you can chase them, as you were able to beforehand. Afterwards, you're pretty much out of options. If you have not killed the enemy, you need to go into your ultimate to kill them, but that wasn't all that different beforehand. Yeah, you can run up to the enemy and melee them and try to kill them that way if you want to clean up the kill, but that has always been risky as Freya, and you're looking more to back out and get some safe poke instead if you can't burst the enemy down. The difference is that your downtime in between is now much longer. You still have that internal cooldown of 30 seconds that you have to wait out before you can engage in the same way again. So you have to be a lot more cautious of when you're going in and consider if you really want to go all in at that point, proc your passive and try to take them down, or if it's worth saving the passive and not going for the poke. This applies similarly for the others as well. With Chronos you'll probably look to hit it when the 2 procs, and then with Sol it doesn't really matter all too much when you connect it, you just want to spam down your AAs after your 2 usually, when the enemy is already locked down a fair bit. Especially Sol, however, who looks to get those big ultimate scalings off, will probably benefit from Hastened Ring quite a bit. So while not quite as good in some regards as the old Hastened for the mages, I do think that Hastened Ring opens up new opportunities with the power and may allow other guards to pick it up in a less wonky strategy as well. I'm thinking Poseidon here, Ao Kwang, we'll talk about him in more detail tomorrow. Quite a few strategies where it can be applied better than it used to be beforehand. As such, both the new Hastened items are pretty good. The item that I personally don't see as much yet is Atalanta's Bow. Atalanta's Bow is 2,300 gold, 30 physical power, 20% attack speed. Additionally, hitting basic attacks increase your movement speed by 7% per stack, stacking up to 4 times, lasting 2 seconds. Now let's compare this to Ekeivil. Ekeivil has 30% attack speed, 10% more. It has 10 physical penetration, which is, like I said, somewhat around, maybe a little less damage for some. But it also steals up to 30 power from the enemy, so if they have Atalanta's Bow, you just steal all their power. And it is 600 gold cheaper, so it's much better for an early power spike. As such, Atalanta's Bow is kind of awkward. You will still get the movement penalty when you hit someone, so all this movement is basically halved. Sure, if you're looking for a build with a high movement strategy behind it for someone like Artemis, where you're looking to build Wind Demon as well and then maybe Poison Star to slow the enemy down, it might work, but overall it's very wonky and the stats in terms of raw damage are not good enough in my opinion to justify the movement speed passive that only stacks over time. It's not that often that you're gonna hit 4 shots and have an enemy that you need to still chase for an extended period of time anyways. Usually the trades are over at that point, and the benefit of other items around the same level should be much bigger. Even items like Odysseus' Bow, who have their bouncing passive, can benefit you more in some situations, as they can bounce on over further distances, not needing you to be close to the enemy as someone else can be around that you can bounce off. As such, I would say out of the 3 options, Atalanta's Bow is definitely the weakest. You also cannot really do a strategy where you skip boots for this in return, because you'll need like 3 hits on this item to even compensate for the lack of movement speed that you would otherwise have through boots directly already. Or to make it simple, look at Ninja Tabi again. Almost the same power, 800 gold cheaper, and 2/3 of the movement speed right off the bat, without having to stack them on the enemy first. That sounds a lot better to me, honestly. Yes, you can obviously combine it with Hastened Katana, but I think there are much better options that still give movement speed, like for example Stone Cutting Sword, and just give you a lot more damage or utility than Atalanta's Bow can. With that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was insightful and gave you some more information about these items and how I feel about them. If you're not subscribed yet, feel free to click that sub button and maybe the bell, it really helps me out. See you for the next one tomorrow. Duke Sloth, out.